One of the major topics of your Alexander module is Alexander's relationship with his Macedonian troops. So we're going to have a quick look at that right now. You need to have an awareness of it for your 40-mark questions, and it's perfectly possible it could be a Section A question as well. Alexander's early career is typified by strong support from the Macedonian army. Indeed, Plutarch says that just before the Battle of Coronea, that Alexander is referred to by the Macedonian troops as their king, and Philip is actually their general. Once Philip is assassinated, Alexander still maintains the support of the Macedonians. He's elected as king by a council of the nobles, and Alexander swiftly neutralizes opposition in the form of Attalus. Indeed, the first part and half of the Alexander campaigns, there's very little in terms of tension between Alexander and his army. The only tension really being is the friction between Alexander and Parmenio. Parmenio, one of the trusted generals of Philip, but frequently undermined by Alexander in a range of ways. Here's 6 examples of when Parmenio is either undermined or criticised, either in warning of the crossing of the river Granicus, the warning about the possible assassination plot by Alexander's doctor Philip, the dismissal of Parmenio's advice to take Darius' offer, his performance at Gaugamela, particularly in the Plutarch, of tensions between Alexander and his own troops. Indeed, Plutarch tells us that the troops maybe started to see Alexander's campaigns as an intolerable burden. Certainly, resentment had started to build because of a number of underlying tensions, such as the continuation of the campaign, but also Alexander and his adoption of Persian dress, Persian court etiquette, the appointment of Persian satraps, and obviously highly controversially the marriage to Roxanne and the training of the 30,000 epigonii. All of these could culminate in the alienation and isolation of conservative Macedonians such as Parmenio, Philotas and Clytus. Once we've dealt with these underlying tensions, it's then that these tensions explode into spectacular style in certain examples of friction between Alexander and his own officers. The first one being the execution of Philotas, where overwhelming evidence is apparently presented to Alexander of Philotas' treachery. This is all concerning about a Macedonian Dimnus' plot to assassinate Alexander, where he approaches his lover Nicomachus. Nicomachus refuses to take part in the plot, informs his brother Ceballinus, and both attempt to try and tell Alexander, where Philotas twice denies them an audience with Alexander. Innumerable accusations are brought against Philotas, and Philotas is executed. Arrian also links an apparent plot in Egypt, which Alexander had earlier ignored. The really key impact of the Philotas plot is, as Plutarch tells us, the actions making Alexander dreaded by his friends. The second example is the murder of Clytus. The spark of the murder of Clytus was the drinking song mocking dead Macedonian commanders. Certainly Clytus does display aggression in it, in terms of his critical speech of Alexander's actions. However, Alexander himself can't be excused from the murder of Clytus. It's his encouragement of the drinking song, his accusation of Clytus' cowardice, and also the fact that he actually does stab Clytus himself. Clytus, if you remember, re-enters the room saying that awesome quote, "Alas, what evil customs reign in Greece." Both our sources, but in particular Plutarch, are at real pains to stress that it's not actually Alexander's fault that he murders Clytus. It's actually Clytus' fault and fate itself. Indeed, it's misfortune, rather a deliberate act. And you'll remember quotes about Clytus' evil genius and the fact that Clytus was drunk and hot-tempered by nature. Following the murders of Philotas and Clytus, we've also got the conspiracy of the pages headed by Callisthenes. Callisthenes had been present throughout Alexander's campaign, being the official historian, but also his rivalry with Anaxarchus, the other philosopher, had really reached a height following the murder of Clytus, where Callisthenes had been unable to comfort Alexander, whereas Anaxarchus had reassured Alexander that he was the son of Zeus. Zeus was justice, and therefore Alexander could act as he wanted. Callisthenes, however, we know is a reasonably unpopular figure in regard to his stoic lifestyle, his critical speeches of the Macedonians at feasts, but he's also critical of obeisance in a very public way, refusing to perform it. And finally, his advice to the plotter Hermolaus, who asks him how to become the most famous of men, and Callisthenes responds by saying, by killing the most famous of men. Once we've dealt with these examples, we've got to deal with two mutinies against Alexander. The first is the mutiny at Hyphasis. Following the battle at Hydaspes, the Macedonian courage had been blunted. That's what Plutarch tells us. Alexander wanted to continue his campaign, but rumours spread regarding the forces awaiting the Macedonians on the other bank of the river. Alexander's reaction is fairly lenient. He shuts himself up in his tent, he eventually relents, and then gives various orders, letting the Macedonians to break camp. The second mutiny, Opis, the spark course of the mutiny at Opis is the arrival of the Epigonae and the dismissal of the veterans, but there are several differences in our sources. Plutarch's Alexander, you could say, is reasonably lenient in rebuking the Macedonians, dismissing his guards, weeping, and the veterans themselves weep at Alexander's tent, and then they're all reconciled at a feast. The Arian coverage of the mutiny at Opis is incredibly aggressive. We get a much more angry Alexander who uses several quotes in a very emotional speech to attack the Macedonians for mutinying against him. Obviously, he's already pointed out and executed several Macedonians for the mutiny. However, if we're going to deal with Alexander and his relationship with the Macedonians, we must also talk about the positives between Alexander and his own troops. And certainly there is positives in terms of their relationship. Firstly, between Alexander and his troops in terms of entertainments, rewards, paying off debts, his pep talks and speeches, and his sharing in their dangers. But also, there are positives from the troops towards Alexander, certainly from the rank and file Macedonians, in terms of their reaction to Alexander's injury versus the Malians, the fact that there's no unrest at all from the Gedrosian Desert March, and also the reaction in both sources of the men towards the imminent death of Alexander in 323 BC. If we're going to sum up Alexander's relationship with the Macedonians, I guess we could say that it's certainly varied, and he certainly maintains strong support from the rank and file troops throughout his career.